Now let me sort of shift gears a little bit and talk about how HP first got involved with Debian specifically. About a few years ago, folks were sort of looking around in the era of trying to make Linux, the kernel, work on more and more stuff, and we all of a sudden realized that PA-RISC was really the only major 32-bit CPU family that was not running Linux. And for a bunch of us inside old HP, this is frustrating. It was sort of embarrassing, I guess is the right way to put it. But despite a bunch of discussions inside the company, we really couldn't figure out how to get anything useful done. Part of the problem is that since PA-RISC mostly only ever ran HPUX as an operating system, there was this propensity for resolving problems that occurred in ASIC development by hacking something into a device driver and never getting around to updating the reference documents that explained how the chip was supposed to work. So without going and looking at HPUX source code, it was very hard to understand how the hardware worked. And if you looked at HPUX source code, you were sort of tainted, and going off and doing anything with that in an open source operating system project posed real conflict of interest and intellectual property problems. Plus, almost all of the people who thought this would be really cool to work on worked in parts of the company where they were pretty sure their bosses would be really mad if they went off and did this. So the thing that finally sort of broke the camel's back is that a bunch of guys in Ottawa, Canada were sitting around one day thinking up, what would be a cool project that they could go work on for fun that might get them enough visibility and notoriety that somebody important might hire them and they'd all get rich in the end. Well, part of that worked. I don't think any of them have gotten rich, but this group of guys formed this organization called the Puffin Group, and they were doing various consulting work, and one of their fairly high-profile projects is that they made a big public announcement that they were going to start a port of Linux to the PA-RISC architecture. And in fact, they showed up at ALS one year and used one of the project incubator facilities that was provided at ALS that year to get a lot of work done. And they had a very thin path of functioning code that did allow them on one specific model of PA-RISC system to get up to a shell prompt. And everybody went, oh, that's so cool. And in effect, they talked to the right people in HP, and somebody finally got shamed into saying, it's kind of weird to have somebody other than HP doing this and to look like we don't care and aren't participating. So maybe we should figure out how to participate. And after a bunch of discussions, an agreement was reached wherein HP agreed to make various previously proprietary reference documents related to PA-RISC architecture available. And further, some HP employees were encouraged, not just allowed, but encouraged to go help this project a little bit. And things kind of started to snowball and mushroom from there. Not long afterwards, the success part for the Puffin guys is that LinuxCare noticed them and acquired them. And all of a sudden, they were getting paid, real money to work on Linux things. The problem is that meant it was no longer just a fun project for them, and all of a sudden, contracts had to be signed to get LinuxCare to let them keep working on this project and so forth. But after a certain period of time, the kernel was kind of working. We had a tool chain that was pretty reasonable, and everybody looked around and said, well, this would be a whole lot more useful if it were a complete distribution. But there was already this public message that had gone out from HP that Itanium was the future and PA-RISC had a finite lifetime. And so I think quite reasonably, all of the commercial distributions that HP went and talked to that they already had relationships with for providing Linux support for x86 systems and so forth, did a huge ho-hum and said, we're not excited about this, we don't see a huge business opportunity, so why don't you pay us huge amounts of money to go do this work? The problem, of course, is that for HP, this was sort of a community involvement project. It's a, let's learn how this open source thing works, let's do the right thing with respect to the PA-RISC architecture for Linux. But there were no obvious direct business benefits that would come from this. So there was a real problem coughing up a big chunk of money to a commercial distribution to go and do the work. The good news is there were some people working in and around the guys that were working on the kernel who knew something about Debian. Frankly, they're people that I had managed to taint with the Debian virus before the HP Agilent split. And I got a phone call inviting me to come up to a meeting that was happening in one of the HP facilities at about this time. and I was expecting it to be sort of a hack fest kind of thing. When I arrived, I got escorted off to a conference room with 2 or 3 levels of managers who wanted to ask me all sorts of probing questions about how the Debian project worked, and could they do this, and could they do that, and how would you achieve this, and how would you achieve that. And at the end of the day, they decided that the right thing to do was to pursue a Debian distribution port for PA RISC, and they sent me home with a really nice PA RISC system to set up in my basement and use as an auto builder, and it all sort of snowballed from there. There were a bunch of engineers in HP who, as I said, knew Debian and liked it, and so it was sort of a natural thing to chase after. When they decided to do this, and this is before they hired me to go back to work for HP, it was when I was still working for Agilent, they decided that if they were going to do this, they wanted to do it right, for some value of right. And in particular, they didn't want this to be some sort of a fork. They didn't want to go grab a snapshot of Debian, hack on it to make it work on PA RISC, put it up on a website somewhere and say, see, look what a great thing we did. Instead, they really wanted to figure out how to participate in the project and make a real Debian HPPA port happen for the next stable release. And that is, in effect, what ended up happening. HP chose to continue the contract with Linux Care for a while because that's where the cool toolchain guys were at the time. They hired some existing Debian developers and added them to this gradually starting to build thing called the Linux Systems Operation, which has changed its name a bunch over the years and is now the core of what we call our open source and Linux organization R&D lab. Oslo R&D for the acronymically inclined. Also, a bunch of HP engineers who are working in and around this PA RISC Linux team were encouraged, if they weren't already, to go become Debian developers, and there was, in fact, a little flurry of activity in that regard, enough so that our DAM at the time accused me of trying to get the value of Q entirely within HP. Those of you who understand how our Constitution is written understand that if you have Q developers, you can propose things and have a majority in meetings and all sorts of interesting things. And I acted surprised because it never occurred to me that HP would ever get so involved with Debian that that would matter to us, but maybe it'll happen someday. But at the end of the day, a lot of interesting work got done. A useful distribution for PA RISC systems did result, and even though HP never figured out how to sell it to anybody, a lot of HP customers really appreciated the company's participation in and sponsorship of that community-oriented project, and it allowed HP to learn a hell of a lot about how the open source community works, how to make things happen when you're not putting lots of money on the table. And at the end of the day, I think this helped to establish the pattern of behaviors that has carried forward until today. This led to the use of Debian for some of the Itanium enablement work in that same R&D lab. And there's lots of development work in various parts of HP, including HP Labs, that gets done on Debian boxes.